Okay, so looking at your study guide, you have a number of topics, and recall that I have constructed the exam to highly correlate with this study guide. So going through this would be a pretty worthwhile use of your time, and now you have a recording to guide you along with that. I'm not going to give you the exact answer here, but I'm going to guide you for what you should be looking for in each of these topics. So beginning, when you look at the difference between macro and micro, you are looking at the difference between the aggregate and the individual. So when we're talking about the aggregate, again, that just means the total, the sum of, and in the context of macro, that is going to be the entire economy. Micro could look at very, very big issues, although they're specific to a business, an industry, a group of consumers. So in other words, a subset of the aggregate. Inflation and deflation, as you might recall, they are discussing the movement of the aggregate price level. So if we see inflation, we're seeing the overall movement of prices on average of goods and services increasing. Similarly, deflation would represent an overall decrease of the average price level of goods and services in the economy. So you clearly get it now. Aggregate behavior is macro behavior, total behavior, aggregate behavior with respect to the national economy. Now, thinking about peaks and troughs, okay, so we can't necessarily say how long they are, how deep they are, but we do know that in business cycles, when they do occur, I mean, we are, I guess if you needed to say it, we're technically in one right now, except we're on the upside. There could be a peak at some point, and as we decline, we have a recession, we have a bottom out of the trough, and this is when we start to see output increasing, unemployment decreasing. We can't say much about prices because it's kind of a wild card with how prices are determined and how they're impacted by recessionary or expansionary behavior. Generally, we can say that in expansions, we do see an increase in inflation. The same cannot be said in a recession. We may see sticky prices or stable prices during recessions. We could see deflation in certain parts of the economy. We could see inflation in certain parts of the economy. So there is not a exact functional relationship with the aggregate price level and business activity. Okay, so recession and depression. Recession is shorter in terms of a decline in output, and a depression, while not having an exact definition, is longer than a recession. So what you want to do is just kind of look for a basic definition of decline, and the opposite, or I guess the counterpart, would be longer than the recession. What is the official unemployment rate equal to? I'm going to have you go into the text and look at this one, but we do know that it is, you should look at the equation, but it's the percentage of the labor force that is actively seeking work and employed. Okay, so we're taking that piece of the total labor force. Okay, unemployment, how does it change in recessions and expansions? Well, remember, we know that it moves countercyclically. So unemployment would increase when we are in a downturn, and unemployment would decrease when we are in an upturn. Let's see, macro goals. I've gone over this a number of times, so you should have it in your notes that we want stability. We want stable GDP, we want stable employment or with the goal of full employment, and we want stable prices. Now, the official unemployment rate we've talked about quite a bit, and what I'm asking you here is, do you recognize that it includes the component of actively seeking work? When we talk about GDP and GNP, the difference here is within domestic borders versus citizenship. Okay, so you can tell that this would include work by citizens in other locations versus all work that is done within the borders of a country. Yes, they have to be final goods. Yes, they have to have a monetary value, and they have to be done within the last year. Let's see, what kind of things are included in GDP, what are not? I'm going to refer you to your homework on that one. We went through a number of those type of examples, and I think that does a pretty good job of what's included. The one thing you want to just realize is what's not included is things that don't have a official like paycheck, illegal things, secondary market things, Savings activities and financial markets, right? All that stuff is not included. What's included are consumption activities, investment activities, government expenditures, and net exports. So you get the idea now when we talked about GDP a number of times and also in the homework, an intermediary good is a component of a final good. The final good is then just the construction of all of the pieces of intermediary goods. We can avoid double counting in GDP by counting the value of the final good and service or the value added of the final good and service. When we talk about GDP being real GDP versus nominal GDP, if you remember that this is a discussion relating to the price level. So real GDP is adjusted for inflation. GDP is not a perfect measurement of productivity or well-being because of all those activities that are not included in GDP and all the activities that are included in GDP that don't necessarily make us better off. Okay, so remember I did things like environmental damage, I did things like health crises. Those are all included even though they're not necessarily great for society as a whole. Flaws of GDP, they do not. It tells us exactly what it is supposed to tell us, and it does not necessarily give us a perfect picture of productivity. It does not give us a perfect picture of well-being. So many bads are included in GDP, and you can refer back to the first PowerPoint that we've used for this section to give you a pretty good sense of that. How might social changes impact GDP, or would they? Well, depending upon what people believe is, if they want to keep living a consumer life or they want to live more of a minimalist life, yeah, that could be how GDP is impacted. If we move towards more informal economies where contracts were less stated and we had more of a kind of under the table market, we could have less recorded activity. Yeah, that could impact GDP. Okay, so who's in the labor force? We know who's in the labor force. It's people who's working, or people who are working and people who are looking for work in the last 4 weeks. If you are not looking for the work in the last 4 weeks, you move into that next category of discouraged. If I included discouraged in the official rate, well, I've included more people that are out of work. So de facto, it means that the unemployment rate would increase. And we saw that when we looked at the U3, U4, U5, and U6. As we keep adding more types of out of work definitions, then that rate just has to, by definition, increase. The unemployment rate doesn't necessarily tell us about the duration of unemployment. It just tells us how many people are actively seeking work. Now, we could look and say, how does the unemployment change through time? That might give us a sense of how out of work people or actively seeking work, how that group of people has moved. But we don't necessarily know individually who the people are, and we don't know their individual circumstances. It is a macroeconomic statistic. So you understand now the idea from your homework of frictional, cyclical, and structural cases. What you need to be able to do in these type of questions is point out if I'm in between jobs, I'm frictional. If I'm unemployed for economic reasons, I'm cyclical. If I have a loss of skills or I have a geographic mismatch, it's a structural issue. Long-term unemployment is out of the labor force, stopped looking for work. It's been a long time, so not a too complex of an idea there. Okay, so moving into the last chapter, there's just a few pieces here. Uncertainty is fundamentally related to the investment decision. So the higher the degree of uncertainty, we're kind of suggesting that animal spirits are towards the risk adverse. People are holding back. People are saving more. People are investing less. And this then directly impacts future spending because there is a connection to future income generation from the production of future output. Let's see. Okay, so there is one graph that I will have you look at, and it is it's in the very end of your chapter, and it is an investment function. Okay, so it is right after, so it's under the section called planned investment and the interest rate. And what you need to do is something very simple. You just need to kind of read a graph that has a downward sloping curve And can you identify how one variable on the horizontal axis changes as the other variable which impacts that variable changes? So could you show me, or could you point out essentially a change in the amount of investment given a price change, i.e. the interest rate? Okay, so use your text for that one if you get confused, or if you need any additional, it's in the PowerPoint, or you can always email me and I'd be happy to help you out. Animal spirits, so you get the idea now. Remember, it's just kind of a proxy for the sense of like excitement or the sense of risk that the economy can feel overall. When is the economy in equilibrium? We can describe it a couple of ways. When aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. In our Keynesian cross that we looked at in class, it's the intersection of the 45-degree curve and the aggregate demand curve. That was C plus I. It could also be listed. It could also be listed as the intersection of planned expenditure and actual expenditure. All of these things are ways to describe a macroeconomic equilibrium. I'd like you to take a look at the short answer. This will not be on your exam, but I did want you to just recall the clip that I showed you about the Great Depression. So you're going to be fine. Study hard. Don't feel like this is enough. My video clip is not enough. And the study guide needs to be used. So you all need to take some time and go through your study guide, use your notes, prepare. And I promise you this will be a lot less painful. All right, good luck.